Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association, Antitrust Law section. My name is John Roberti, and today's topic is it really free? The economics of digital platforms. Almost all of us have had some sort of interactions with the digital platforms that, when it comes to us, it looks like it doesn't cost anything. But how could a business that doesn't charge you anything stay in business? There has to be something else going on. Today, we're going to have a guest who's going to explain to us what are the economics of free and how does that all work? My co-host today is Anora Wang. Hi, Anora.
Hi, John.
Anora, what are we doing today?
Well, today we're going to try to understand the economics of platforms. For instance, what users are transacting or exchanging exactly for their access to any particular platform. We'll go into a little depth to discuss the notion of attention market and also try to distinguish the concept of use versus user.
Who's our guest today?
Well, our guest today is Professor John Young, who I actually took several courses from at George Mason University.
How'd you do?
Well, I think I have A's, right? If not A pluses.
Okay.
Definitely.
Yeah. So Professor Young is an associate professor of law and the director of economic education at the Global Antitrust Institute at the George Mason University. Previously, John was an acting deputy assistant director in the Bureau of Economics with the Federal Trade Commission. Over his 18 years at the FTC, John has presided over a number of high-profile matters and investigations in various industries. And then that explains why he has a broad experience and interest that includes analysis of horizontal mergers, vertical restraints, exclusion. It just goes on, and everything has been tested, in the courses that I took.
And what are we hoping to get out of the discussion today?
Well, as you already alluded to, we're learning about platforms and the economics behind it, and then trying to understand what exactly is the cost and what exactly is that incentivize the users and platforms.
All right, well, let's bring on our guest, Professor John Young.
Thank you, John.
Welcome to the program.
Appreciate it, and thank you, Anora. Thank you for both of us. This is exciting for me.
Welcome to the show. So let's just get straight to the topic. So what exactly is a user exchanging or transacting when I'm accessing a digital platform? Am I selling my privacy or my eyeballs without knowing it?
Yeah, I mean, my view is that users are not strictly exchanging data for access to the platform. Rather, data is a means to an end. And so the key to understanding a free or a zero-price platform or market is that their commercialization depends on some companion product or market. And for something like Google or Facebook, that companion is advertising. And so you need that data to help that monetization through advertising. And so how does that help? Well, it takes one of two paths. The first of it is directly to advertising. Data makes ads significantly more relevant and targeted, and that's study after study consistently shows that it's orders of magnitude more important to have the data to target those ads. Second, data makes the user content more relevant and curated. I don't know if you've ever logged into YouTube in a public computer or without your account. You get video suggestions that are completely, you're like, what is going on here? But when you log in, it feels like a comfortable chair. You're like, oh, these are my videos. These are the suggestions that resonate with me. And so that's the same idea. The data can be used to curate the content, whatever platform you're on, in a way that's appealing to users. So in terms of welfare, it's enhancing for both users and advertisers. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. I wish I could have done this in school. I could just, interrupt my professor at the time I want, and then, hey, can we go back a couple of steps? So you mentioned means to an end and companion product. Can we break that down a little bit? So for different platforms, that's different, right?
Yes.
So video gaming or social, media, they're different, right? Or payment platforms. So that's different.
Yeah, they're very different. In terms of the ad platforms that we traditionally think of, it's a little bit more straightforward, right? The companion product is that advertising or the advertiser side of the platform. For credit cards, it's a little bit different. While it's, let's say, not all cards are free in terms of annual, but those that are free, what do you get access to? You get access to sort of a network of merchants and an ability to pay quickly without having the cash readily available. You can pay later. And so the monetization comes in through the swipe fees through the merchants, that's one, and also through the potential loan or interest that the platform receives from each individual cardholder who might not immediately pay each month. So they're the sort of companion products is a little bit different, but it's the same idea in that there has to be something linked to that zero price or free product.
Right. And you mentioned the data is just a means to end. So I'm paraphrasing a little bit. So my data or whatever user habits that I have, right, and that the platform gets, that's not something that the platform is going after ultimately, right? You said it helps monetization. Is that
right? It's not, if you think about it, data just sitting on a computer or a server in of itself, it just has absolute zero value to any firm. And it's really how do you use that data to monetize and unlock value? And so just focusing again on the attention platforms of advertising, what's happening there is that you're really sort of, if anything, you're exchanging your attention. And that attention isn't complete, right? When you're on Google search or Facebook, your attention is also on the content primarily, but at times you are willing to engage with the advertising. Otherwise, advertising demand on that would be zero if everybody at every time wouldn't give the advertising any sort of attention at all. So you are willing to exchange, if you will, your attention to some degree, and you realize that in exchange for that free or zero price content.
Is this what we call a two-sided market?
It is. In this context, this is a two-sided market. For, if you want to use technical terms, which I wish to avoid, but this would be a non-transaction two-sided market. The credit card would be a transaction two-sided market, but they're both same in that there are multiple groups that this platform or intermediary is trying to sort of facilitate that exchange, whether it's a sort of an ad exchange or whether it's sort of a credit card actual transaction exchange for American Express, for example.
And then for the consumer welfare, and back to the two ways that you said that helps, data helps monopolize. You said one way is about making the target ads more effective, and then the other is to help curate the content, and they are generally or promoting consumer welfare. Is that fair to say?
I do think that's fair to say. Now, I should mention some sort of another effect, but focusing on the effect that you just mentioned, Anora, in terms of the advertiser side, certainly using data to make those ads more targeted and relevant is just, study after study, again, shows that their welfare improves. From the user side, you might be indifferent to an ad, but all else equal, you probably want to see a more relevant ad. So even for them, that's a benefit. But directly for users, it's also the curation of the content. Their data allows for that platform to make that platform more relevant to them. And the platform has an incentive to do that because their attention is really important. So both of those are welfare enhancing. That being said, to the extent that the data being collected is something that's sensitive and that consumers don't want to sort of turn over without some exchange, there is some disutility from that. And so what needs to be... And
disutility is just economist term for bad things. Right?
I know. I use it like it's everyday term. Yeah, it's just something that you don't get a benefit from. In fact, that's a negative for you. And so you need some compensation from that. And so just handing over our privacy, that's uncomfortable. We don't really want to do that. And so this isn't to suggest that, consumers are just handing this out on the street. They need something in return. And some consumers make the decision that it's not worth it. They might not join Facebook or other social media. And that's perfectly fine. And so that's where consumer protection comes into play a little bit more.
When I look at ads that some of these data platforms select for me, I say, wow, they must think I'm really old, or they must think I'm really not cool. And I would like to try to improve my level of coolness to get better ads. I guess that's not a disutility.
It could be, when maybe you've achieved your level and you start seeing ads that you're like, oh, this is for the cool kids.
Yeah.
I've reached status here.
I'm going to work on that, but maybe we should coming back to it. So, as an economist, if you're trying to assess whether something that is free overall is bad for consumers, how do you do that? How could free be bad?
And it goes back to what it's being linked to, and consumers, to the extent that they know that can have them make the right decision. And so it can be bad when the disutility of your attention, let's say the ad is super obnoxious. There are sites that are basically spam. Maybe you get a little bit of content, but you have to put up with so much flashing ads that it's not worth that exchange. And so yes, while it's free, it's completely not worth it in terms of your time. Alternatively, there could be something that really has a lot of value, but you really have no idea how much data they're collecting. Some mobile apps that it looks like it's from guy in a garage, and you're like, oh, this isn't even a company. It's just this guy. What's he doing with the data? Then you're like, well, yeah, the game's kind of fun, but what is he doing with it? And that that sort of lack of certainty really makes you not want to join. And so again, while free, that exchange and that uncertainty makes you make a decision that you don't want to join.
So we've been using the term exchange, right? So I am giving up something, or paying something, in order to access a platform. If it's not data itself, and I get the point about monetization. So could it be, could be broadly saying that I'm giving up something like my attention, and is that still a notion that's valid and worth discussing?
Yeah, Anora, I definitely think to me, that's the right way to view at least ad platforms is that you are giving some of your attention to these ads. You see them. You can't avoid them typically. There are maybe some platforms where you can effectively never see them, but generally speaking, you can't avoid them. And so consequently, that results in some exchange, if you will, of your attention for the content. And you ultimately think it's worth it.
Right. And I think I've read somewhere else about the notion of the attention market. Maybe also, I guess another way of saying that is that I am the product. As a user, my eyeballs are what's being sold on a platform. Is that something true? And how does an economist view it?
Yeah, I've heard that characterization, and there's always a grain of truth to these, and it's persisted. And I don't necessarily view it as that we're exchanging ourselves, if you will, that we are the product. In a sense, our attention and how, if we characterize that as us and we're exchanging our attention as basically we are the product, then if to the extent that that's what it's describing, it's accurate, but it sort of invokes different types of thoughts. And so I generally think it's more just specifically our attention that we're trying to sort of exchange. And this is an idea you just mentioned that others have picked up. David Evans and Professor Tim Wu, they all sort of favor this attention market. And that actually has implications for antitrust because it really affects how we sort of define the relevant market when we focus on attention rather than sort of features of a platform per se, which are not irrelevant, but the ultimate question is what do consumers view as a substitute for their time for these free resources? Because it's not their actual, monetary exchange. It's going to be their time. And so which ones are fungible? It might not necessarily be based on sort of functional overlaps.
Yeah. So, when I hear arguments like that, I always think, because it's so simple, it sounds true. They're all competing for my time. They're all competing for my attention, which is a very true general statement. But how does it help with antitrust analysis, right? Is it really true that when I'm going to a video gaming platform versus a different, maybe a very niche Hobbit focused platform, is that really the same, right? My attention devoted to those two platforms, are they all fungible or interchangeable?
Yeah, I like to think of it this way. We like to use functionality and features to define markets because it's often a pretty good proxy for consumer demand. But it's important to realize it's not exactly consumer demand, which is ultimately what we're trying to measure with relevant markets. So I'll give you an example. Let's take water. I remember I was on a matter where it was some consumer product downstream, and something that you buy in a grocery store, and they said, well, our biggest substitute is tap water at the gym. And while they were laughed out of the room, but I just thinking back, functionally, a lot of what their product was doing is exactly the same that water does, H2O. So if we can go too far with the functional overlap, because I think many of us would find that ridiculous that tap water is a substitute for spring water from the consumer level, but they are certainly the same chemical, sort of identically the same chemically. Another example is, let's say, toothbrushes. Is battery-powered toothbrushes in the same relevant product market as manual? Well, most of us would, in antitrust, would say, well, that's an open question. Let's look at the data.
Right.
But functionally, some people would say, well, they both brush teeth. They do the same thing. How are they not substitutes for consumers? So in the same way, if we take this over to digital platforms and say, well, is Facebook a substitute for, let's say, online banking? Well, there the functional differences are so stark, I think it's reasonable, at least as a presumption, that these are not in the same relevant product market. But let's make it more difficult. Let's take Google, Disney Plus, and Netflix. Okay, we're like, oh yeah, those are probably overlaps. How about Disney Plus and Netflix versus cable television or streaming sports? Now it's more about our attention, and you're like, well, they're showing different things, or they seem slightly different, so maybe they're different. And I think focusing on attention might get us the better answer rather than functionality per se. Now, that sounds like I'm trying to expand markets and everything's in the market. That's not the goal. The goal is really to understand consumer behavior. It can work in the other way. Let's take Facebook and Instagram. Many people have very strong views on that on both sides. So that's not the debate. But the debate is, well, you could say they have different features. Facebook does words and Instagram does pictures. But I would say that's not really the right metric. It's really about the attention. And that attention could make them overlaps when functionally they seem different. So I think it can work both ways.
Right. And I think something, memories flash back. Like in classes, you always talk about diversion, right? It's not just like, functional exchange, like, how much they're exchangeable, but also how do we measure it, right? Like someone who is likely to use electro-powered toothbrush, how is likely he or she is going to divert when there is no such product, but to a different product? Is that something that we can use in the attention market?
Yes, absolutely, Nora. To me, diversion ratio, this term is one of the best terms that we've been using recently. And what does it mean? It just means basically when consumers leave a specific product, let's say that it was recalled, or there's price went up, or for whatever reasons, when consumers leave, we basically track them and say, where do they go? And then we do a ratio. Who do they go to? And what percent of those who left go to this product and go outside the product market that we're hypothesizing? And to me, that's like at the core intuition of what we're trying to achieve with antitrust is who's the closest guys? Where do these diverted products go to? And so attention market is the same idea. And the point that I think is really important is that we don't limit to functionality per se. That, again, can give us a starting point and it give us a lot of intuition and maybe rule out a good chunk of products, but then it gets more difficult and we really ultimately need to get to diversions.
Right, and revealed behavior.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I guess let's get to maybe a little bit with the normative implication of the attention market. Like, is it good attention seeking or something that's actually socially harmful?
Yeah, I brought up this curation and how data makes YouTube more relevant. And I remember I got a question in the audience at one conference, and she was really upset about it. She said, that's illegitimate. In fact, it's worse. It makes you stay on YouTube. And that's like something that you shouldn't do. And it really addicts people. And so taking a step back, we're getting into obviously value judgments of these products and what we would call in economics normative judgments. And there's nothing wrong with that sort of culturally, but within antitrust, I get nervous when we start going in that direction, and particularly as an economist, because we tend to sort of like to have the consumers validate their own choices, and there's a reason that they make their choices.
Occasionally, I've been accused of engaging in attention-seeking behavior, but the question I have for you is I think related, and that is on this program we cover antitrust. We also cover privacy law, and privacy law, I think, is trying to regulate the harm that comes on the other side of the free. How might privacy regulation distort, economic choices or be relevant to competition?
Yeah, privacy regulation, it obviously depends on how it impacts the consumers and the incentives of the platform itself. John, you might be thinking of something else, but when I hear of privacy regulations, a lot of what at least initially I think of is, let's say, what's opt-in, what's opt-out, what do they have to disclose, sort of what is sort of that relationship between the platform and the consumer in terms of that data exchange and how that exchange occurs. And so to the extent that that's going to distort that, maybe in a good way, in that there was some type of market failure in the sense that consumers weren't fully informed, or they thought it was this and it was something quite different, or there is something called rational ignorance as well, in that we purposely are not informed on something. So I get, a little bit suspicious of surveys saying, well, most consumers have no idea. Well, they don't have an idea because they really just don't care to have an idea. But that being said, yeah, privacy regulation will ultimately impact these issues, no doubt about it.
And then last, since we promised our listeners, so last chunk of a substance, but maybe not a big chunk, how to distinguish users and use, and how does that help us understand the incentives of platforms? Yeah,
no. So if we really do sort of believe in this attention paradigm, what's really more important is use rather than users per se. And so why does this distinction matter? When we're teaching platforms, we say, there's two sides and you want more users. And that's a useful sort of teaching mechanism. But if we want to get precise, it's use. So if you're a Facebook, you would rather have 10 people on for 100 hours a week each, rather than having 100 people on for 1 minute a week. It's really about that intensity. And so why does this matter? Well, it gets into what is contestable. So if we think of Facebook, many have said, well, they're saturated and the market they don't have room to grow. And so all they're doing is basically harvesting whatever market power they may have. But if we realize that it's use that they're interested, then their behavior makes sense, in that why are they continually designing new features and competing in other spaces? Some would say, oh, they're trying to extend their power to those areas and knock off nations who are more innovative. But if we take a step back, perhaps it's because they are competing for that marginal attention that they're seeking. It's great that someone's on Facebook, but Facebook wants them to be on it more. My final thought on this, John and Nora, I'm guessing you have more than one credit card in your wallet.
Yeah.
And you have a favorite. And those who are not your favorites would like to be your favorites. They're just sitting in your wallet. You use it on occasion, maybe for a reward for a specific type of store or category. But they want you to use it more. So they're still competing for your sort of exchange every time you make an exchange. And so that's contestable. And contestability is really important in terms of incentives to compete.
That's great. So, it's like, really memory flashes. It's like another class with antitrust economics. You obviously love what you do. And then could you tell us a little bit about why it makes it so fun and exciting? And, every day you're coming to class, it's like, full of energy. How is it? What drives you?
No, that's a great question. When I was at the FTC, I loved the antitrust, but I didn't love it. You're doing law enforcement every day and you're in the middle of it. And
I thought law enforcement is exciting.
Yeah, it can be exciting. I wish we had a badge that we could,
right,
flash around. But being in academia and teaching students like you, Anora, and going to conferences and doing fun things like this podcast, it really just is an exercise of just a lot of fun, because antitrust is the perfect intersection of law and economics. And so we're bringing so many diverse groups together in terms of this exchange, and it has such policy implications that I just think everyone's just having a lot of fun, to be honest with you, in antitrust.
I just want to point something out. We've had law professors on our program, and we've asked them those questions. And I think consistently up until today, it has always been, the reason I love being a law professor is because I love the students. Students bring me so much energy. Now, Anora, I don't know what that says about your experience and what you did to Professor Yan. But what advice would you have for a younger person who wants to get into this field?
Just focusing I think it applies to attorneys as well, but particularly for economists, is that I think agency experience, to the extent that you can get it, is really nice. It doesn't mean that there's plenty of people with great antitrust careers without that, but for me, just speaking from my personal experience, that it's been tremendous, and there's so many good people in the agency that when you come out, you just have a different perspective. You have fun war stories, and so for me, it's really about focusing on that. Now, if you don't have that opportunity, then it's really just to engage the economics of it. Because to me, once you get that and comfortable with the economics of antitrust, then you can basically engage in every debate and not just sort of legal technicalities.
And Professor Young, tell us something that is interesting or unusual about yourself that we wouldn't know if we only knew you professionally.
I mean, I grew up I was born in South Korea, but I grew up in Savannah and Marietta, Georgia. So I consider myself a Southerner. And so I love Georgia Bulldogs football, even though I didn't go there. So I'm one of those people who didn't go there, but I root for the team. But I'm a UCLA Bruin basketball fan at a deep level. But in terms of something deeply interesting, it was really hard. And so sadly, the best I can come up with is I am the men's Cobb County middle school typing champion. And so if you need a memo done, John and Nora,
oh, wow.
I'm really fast.
Is that speed or accuracy or both?
Both.
Okay.
Both.
And on the college sports, true or false, I have painted my face?
False.
False. Okay, so let's go to our final segment, which we call The Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
In my left hand, I have an actual hat that has actual questions in it. Professor Young is going to choose a question out of the hat right now, and we are going to ask him that question. And the question that he has chosen is question number 9, which is, if you had to describe yourself in 3 words, what would they be?
Not equation.
Straightforward, simple, and honest.
And if you had to describe the perfect podcast in 3 words, what would they be?
There's only one correct answer to that.
The Curious Amalgam.
We'll accept that. It was our Curious Amalgam is the right answer.
Right.
And with that, we will see you next time on Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust Section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.